the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at Bank of Baroda, Mughal Tent. We are delighted to introduce women who wear only themselves, yoga, poetry, and culture. This session is presented by BluOne Inc. and is part of the Mind, Body, and Soul series. I think we can do with that in this heat for sure. Arundhathi Subramaniam is an award-winning poet, author, and critic who has contributed greatly to contemporary spiritual writing and exploration. Her works include Love Without a Story, Women Who Wear Only Themselves, Eating God, and Sadhguru, More Than a Life. She combines poetry, prose, and spiritual experience in a study of the paths to self-knowledge and the nature of truth. In conversation with Puneeta Roy, Arundhathi discusses the confluence of literature, culture, and yoga, the ultimate practice and meeting place for individual consciousness and the universe. Arundhathi is a leading Indian poet and the award-winning author of 13 books of poetry and prose, more recently the poetry volume Love Without a Story, and a book of conversations with female sacred travelers. Women Who Wear Only Themselves. Other works include the anthology of sacred poetry, Eating God, and the best-selling biography of Sadhguru, More Than a Life. She is the winner of the Sahitya Akademi Award for 2020, the Khushwant Singh Poetry Prize, the Raza Award, among others. Puneeta is a media professional who is passionate about integrating young people from diverse social economic backgrounds and channeling their energies to work on issues of social justice. Currently, she is deeply invested in using the arts to build emotional intelligence and self-esteem amongst children in conflict with law. Over to you, Puneeta.
Thank you so much, Ashok. Welcome, everyone. I know it's a really hot, dusty afternoon, but I want to first just say how deeply honored I am, Arundhathi, to be here on the platform with you and to be able to ask you questions, which have actually been intriguing me as I've been reading your books. Start off with, it's been a prolific outpouring of creative expression, 13 books on prose and poetry. But I'm going to start straight off with your fascination for the female voice, right? Starting with immersing yourself in the bhakti poets, the mystic poets. You speak about, Meera Devi, Andal, Akka Mahadevi, and moving to contemporary women, the contemporary women who you speak about here. It's a fascinating title, Women Who Only Wear Themselves. And the contemporary women you're talking about, you say, what about the quiet women? And you call them a fragrance in the wilderness and a lotus in the marsh. I love the imagery that, that conjured up for me. And these are women who are, you say, sensual, passionate, and, they don't seem to say that you have to give up the material for the spiritual, right? So I want you to just first, considering that you yourself identify yourself as a seeker, and you say that this book came about from a thirst for conversations with fellow travelers. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the inspiration and the journey that this book took you on?
I will. And I just want to say thank you, those of you who braved the afternoon heat to be here at the Mughal tent. And I want to say how honored I am to be talking to you.
Oh,
it's very special to be talking to a fellow traveler. And I know you're one.
Thank you.
And I'll just say something about the book, and then maybe, Puneeta, we can just talk about journeys and perhaps what led to my own and how I ended up with this particular book. The journey as far as this book, if I were to just talk about this particular book, I'd say that for many years, I've been a seeker for as long as I could remember. I was a closet seeker, and then at one point I was compelled to come out of the closet. We can talk about that later.
Yes.
And one of the things that struck me was the fact that while I was very deeply nourished by all the male mystics I had read, from the Buddha to Krishnamurti and Ramana Maharishi and Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Osho and so many others, Meister Eckhart and Hafiz and Rumi and many more. One of the lacunae in my life, I realized, was the presence of women's voices. And I was reading not just the dead mystics, I'd met some of the male mystics of my own. I did a book on Sadhguru, which came out of long conversations with him. But there was a thirst for the voices of women. Because I do think that in subtle ways, and sometimes not so subtle ways, women walk the spiritual path somewhat differently. In my university years, I remember reading this line by a Christian feminist theologian, Valerie Saving-Goldstein. And she says that if for the male seeker, the male spiritual seeker, the obstacle is often hubris, pride. For the woman spiritual seeker, the obstacle is often something quite different. And we make the mistake of treating both journeys as identical, when in fact they are not. And what she suggests is that for women, very often, the obstacle could quite well be the impulse to outsource one's self-definition, the impulse to look elsewhere for validation, for approval, for identity. And so the central question, I think, behind this book and behind my current preoccupations is really if every spiritual tradition speaks on some level of surrender, what does that really mean? Surrender is a loaded word. Absolutely. Just like God is a loaded word.
Absolutely.
And what does it mean to surrender a self that you haven't even been encouraged to value? What does that kind of surrender mean? I'd say that at the heart of it, that is the question at this book, really at the center of this book.
Of the book, okay.
Of women who wear only themselves. I realized that in the past decade, I had actually met some fascinating women. A couple of those conversations stayed with me. And in the great quiet of the pandemic, when I looked at the transcripts of those interviews, I realized that there was some remarkably rich material in there. And that's when I decided that if I was fascinated by these journeys, there had to be some reader out there who would want to hear about them too. These are 4 utterly diverse women. One is a monk, one is a Marxist turned mystic, one is Nada Yogini on the path of yoga of primal sound. One wears ochre, the other wears blue jeans, and the third has cast off all clothing altogether. She's a naked woman mystic. They're just wildly diverse. So I wanted to talk about them because I didn't want to talk about any singular journey.
Right.
They are so diverse that to my mind, they point to the absolutely crazy plurality of sacred paths still available to us in this country.
So that we don't stereotype anyone.
Absolutely. And so that we don't freeze these. I'm just constantly, I think, even as a poet, responding to all the attempts around us to freeze language, whether it's into slogan or scriptural certainty or any kind of sacred or secular diktat and formula.
Right.
For me, these are women whose paths are unfolding even as we speak.
Yeah.
They're following their journey, they're improvising on their journey, and they're inventing their journey all at once.
Right. It's interesting you use the word freeze. At one point, you speak about the fact that we think a spiritual journey is about peace of mind. And you say it's actually about a heightened inner awakening and awareness. And that your own journey got you to unfreeze aspects within you that you weren't even aware of. And that meant in your body, in your mind, in your soul. I mean, you know. So would you like to share something about the unfreezing aspect?
I think unfreezing is perhaps at the heart of it. When I began my spiritual journey in a more formal way, in terms of a formal discipline, I hoped to become this wonderfully tranquil human being until I realized that there is really no sacred journey that can be undertaken by some sliver of the cerebral cortex, that it in fact was a journey that plunged me into my body and it plunged me into my heart. And those were inconvenient places to be, and those were uncomfortable places to be, but necessary and rewarding in their own way. So that was, I think, the beginning of my realization that there is really no spiritual journey that can allow you to live in compartments. So I could no longer be that closet seeker that I spoke of. I could no longer be a closet seeker who was also a poet in my daytime avatar, and a curator and another avatar, and a critic in yet another. All those compartments in many ways just fell flat. It felt, as I said in a poem, it felt like I opened the coffee percolator and the roof flew off.
Wow.
It really felt that way. So that's when I discovered a new set of fellow travelers. And those were the Bhakti poets whom you mentioned earlier, Puneeta. The Bhakti poets, because I'd grown up with them as a child. I'd grown up watching Indian classical music and dance performances. That had been a part of my life. I grew up with these poets, but I never believed, I never realized that these were poets who were capable of such utterly subversive relationships with the divine.
That's very interesting. Subversive relationships with the divine.
Yes, because I had grown up believing that bhakti meant devotion.
Right.
And I thought devotion simply meant longing for this God, this unattainable, sometimes elusive, in the love poems that permeate our bhakti tradition, sometimes an unpunctual male God.
Right, like Krishna. Yes, absolutely.
One who often returns with telltale signs of his lovemaking with other women.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the poetry is about the waiting female, the pining female. And those were images of passivity that I just could not relate to. So I thought this was poetry of a moment and that it wouldn't really speak to me until my own journey deepened. And I discovered these poets in an altogether new way. And that's when I realized that bhakti is not passive yearning at all. Bhakti is this wild, destabilizing, disruptive science of the heart. It compels you to live in all those inconvenient crevices that you'd rather otherwise ignore.
Right.
So the Bhakti poets actually yearn for God, but also argue with God, also quarrel with God, also make love to their gods, also eat their gods, also dispense with their gods, and still continue on their spiritual journey.
Right. You have a book called Eating with God?
Eating God.
Eating God. Wow. Okay. Okay. Now I want to just go a little back where you spoke about the kind of, the tearing open of your heart and becoming aware of, spaces within you that were not comfortable. Right. I have found that, as you sort of move deeper inward, it's like a peeling away of layers. And somewhere you seem to get closer and closer to shedding all those, protective layers you've done as an adult, getting a little closer and closer to that child that's there in you. And so you feel your emotions with an intensity that you would as a child, and you cannot conceal anything. The transparency that comes with it. It's scary. I think it scares people around you. You know, oh my God, I thought she was so peaceful, and it's suddenly there's like this Kali that comes out, you know. But I want to actually ask you for that period when you felt that emptiness within you, when you felt that your work, I mean, there was this void, this darkness, and you were clearly struggling to see the light. We'll come to the light a bit later. But could you share something of that, you know, that episode in your life and where that led you?
It happened in April 1997. I was returning from a particularly relaxed vacation in Nepal. I mentioned the relaxed vacation because there was nothing wrong with me physically. I was well. Nothing wrong with me psychologically. I've been depressed before, but this was not depression. And all I know is that I went through a process that, for want of a better word, I think of as a process of dying. It felt like my deepest confrontation with emptiness that I've known. And this was not a psychological or a physical emptiness. This was as close as it gets for me. It was an existential emptiness. It was darkness, it was silence, a terrifying silence. And the first thing that struck me is that until then, I believed that my answers would come through words. My answers would come through literature. My answers would come in poetry. And this was when I realized that language had failed me utterly. And the only thing that was clear to me as I came out of this phase, which lasted about a week, the only thing that was clear to me is that I needed to make my peace with this silence, and I needed guidance. Desperately needed guidance. And I had to swallow a great deal of intellectual arrogance to go around looking for that guidance.
So where did you start? By reading, back to words first?
Reading, yes, but one thing I did realize is that philosophy was no longer enough. It was the mystics I needed to read, because the mystics spoke of the existential questions in a way that made sense to me. Saint John of the Cross made sense to me. Ramana Maharishi made sense to me. But I also realized I needed living guidance. And that seemed crazy because gurus happened to other people. For people like me, bred in Bombay and lovers of literature, and those of us who hung out in bookshops and cafes, books happened to us, conversations happened to us, psychotherapists happened to us, gurus did not happen to us. So that was not an easy.
And that was 3 years.
7 years.
7.
7 years of fevered quest.
Okay.
Until 2004, it was May 2004, when I met my guru. And there was a great sense of
Coming home? In a way?
homecoming.
Yeah.
And then, of course, another journey unfolded. Meeting your guru is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning of one. And that became a journey that lasted many years, and I needed many new travelers. I met many new travelers on the way who helped, some of them living and some of them dead. The dead ones were the Bhakti poets who became my literary ancestors. I reclaimed them in a way that I never had before. They spoke to me about the fact that devotion, bhakti, is not about servitude. They reminded me that surrender is not about enslavement. They reminded me that dissent is not about disloyalty. They reminded me that God or Guru is not your boss, but your birthright. And when that became a living reality in many ways, I realized that the Bhakti poets all along, at least in the poetry, are inviting us again and again to question hierarchy, again and again. And the closer you get to this moment of mystical union, which in Bhakti poetry is so often presented in terms of metaphors of sexual union, you realize that all the identities, all the definitions are in fact in a state of hectic flux. You really don't know where the human ends and the divine begins. And that's what the Bhakti poets remind us of. And I wondered why in all those years, Puneeta, of having grown up with them, why I had never heard this, why I had never really tuned in to this resonance.
But don't they say that when the student is ready, the guru beckons? You were clearly ready to be able to read into that now.
I was, and I was also, I think, ready to undertake this roller coaster ride, which is what the relationship with the guru always is, I think, for everyone.
Yeah, yeah.
And made many discoveries along the way, particularly the fact that there is nothing authoritarian about the guru-shishya relationship, nothing stuffy and hierarchical about the guru-shishya relationship. It took me a long time to understand that.
Absolutely. And that's a pretty volatile sort of, thought, because it's against all our traditional conditioning here. Yeah. Arundhathi, at this point, I want to pause and ask you, would you like to read a poem that you have written? I mean, is there something here you'd like to share? Or you have something in your mind that you...
I was actually going to read Janabai to you. I'd like to read a Bhakti poet to you, and then later, if there's time, I'll read you a poem of my own.
Please. Okay.
But we were talking about the body, and there is really no one like Janabai. Actually, no one like all the Bhakti. There are so many of them who remind you that the body is a site of perishability, a place of transience, a place of disease. But there are also so many of them who remind you that the body is a site of transformation, that without the body, there would be no spiritual journey. Whether it's Basavarna, the 12th century Kannada mystic who says the moving temples are the ones that last. Whether it's Devara Dasamaya, the 10th century Kannada mystic who says to his God, you give me a body and then you ask me to transcend it.
Right.
Is that fair? He says, why don't we have a conversation? You take on a body, Ramanatha, he tells his God, and then we'll have a conversation. And so that brings me to Soirabai, the 14th century Dalit woman mystic who says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, show me who wasn't born of that blood. And Janabai, who says in this translation by Arun Kolatkar, I eat God, I drink God, I sleep on God, I buy God, I count God, I deal with God. God is here, God is there, void is not devoid of God. God is within, God is without, and what's more, there's God to spare.
That's lovely, Arundhathi. I wanted to just ask you about, we're talking about God, about the place for the goddess, right? The Devi, the Shakti, the divine feminine, that we do connect with her, but at times, like as I was telling you, I had a personal initial fear of the goddess Kali till I learned to really embrace her and understand what I was being afraid of. And we constantly feel that, that women should connect with the divine feminine only, but there is a place for both, right? So what is that relationship? And can each one of us choose our own relationship with the male and the female? I mean, I know about the Ardhanareshwari, but when we talk about, when they say, when a woman is disturbed or sort of really feeling empty, there seems to be this thing, no, but the goddess is within you. What does it take for us to connect with that goddess within us?
What a wonderful question. For many years, there are many ways I could answer that question, Puneeta, but let me try and make it as experiential as possible. For many years, I liked the notion of a goddess in terms of some intellectual resonance. Yeah. It appealed to feminist sensibilities and all of that, but I didn't really know what it was about. In the year 2011, I think, I first entered the goddess temple at the ashram that I frequent, which is the Isha Yoga Center. And I went in there and I sat. It was a recently consecrated goddess temple, the temple of Linga Bhairavi.
It's very powerful, the energy there, yes.
It is. And that's when I realized no one needed to explain the goddess to me anymore. No one needed to explain to me how the goddess is meant to be approached. There was a deep sense of recognition, joy, the sense of kinship under the skin, and yet the sense of the great pride and freedom that is possible when you realize that the theism of this relationship allows you to see her as divine mother and friend and someone whom you're deeply connected to under the skin as well. And the goddess for me is that principle that engages, that gets her hands messy in the business of life, who understands the particular, who doesn't need you to translate your predicament in any way. She gets you right there. She's with you. And which is why I say in the book that for me, the guru was the road map back to myself, and the goddess was a reminder that I had never left home at all. And I think we need both, the roadmap and that reminder. I certainly do. And I'm deeply grateful to both. I couldn't do without either.
Without either. How wonderful. So just for someone who is on the periphery, who thinks spirituality, I mean, I've had many people, who come to me and say, I'm still in the business of life. And, when I'm retired, I will think of being spiritual. I know that there is a collective consciousness that's raising, people are getting interested in energy healing and in other sorts of alternate systems. For someone who's not quite, who's on the periphery, wondering, where do I dip into this huge ocean, this ocean of limitless, unlimitless love? What would you suggest? Where does one begin? Is there any one way to do it, or?
Thankfully, there is no one way to do it. And that was why the Bhakti poets were so wonderful, because they reminded you that you could be intensely local and find your own local key to the universal. There's really no one way, and there must never be. If there is any must, that is the only must. There must never be only one way to do it. But I would say this, one thing I did learn about the connection between poetry and my spiritual journey was this, that neither of them is really about conclusion. None of them is about certainty. The connection for me between poetry and the spiritual journey is that both of them are invitations to arrive at a spirited response to uncertainty. They're both about living in wonder. They're both about living in bewilderment. They're both about not knowing and realizing that not knowing is not cowardice, that conclusions, in fact, are often about cowardice.
But this is about a continuum.
It is about a continuum, and it is about also being happily non-utilitarian. This is something I always knew as a poet, that poetry didn't cure a toothache, and it didn't ever increase the GNP, and it could never reverse the Arctic meltdown, and neither does the spiritual journey. So you don't turn to it for utilitarian reasons, but you turn to it for the sheer joy of aliveness. And you turn to it because whatever you do after that is that much more energized, that much more authentic, that much more you.
Arundhati, when we're young, we always have these aspirations of what our life is going to pan out as, right? So when you look back, what has the change been in the last, so you're saying 97, so the last 20, 25 years? Has Arundhati Subramaniam changed in any way? Or has it been a path that you sort of set out on as a young child? And it's just flowering and opening up more and more?
I don't think I'm alone in this. I think many of us know this in our own ways, that there is a path of learning. Then there is the whole journey of unlearning, which you realize is going to take you a lifetime. And then there is the fact that you begin to see that both the learning and the unlearning can in fact go together.
Right.
So Lata Mani, who's one of the seekers in this book, one of the spiritual travelers in this book, starts out as a Marxist and a feminist, has a car accident that plunges her into a spiritual journey. Tantra is her path. The Devi is her guide. And she now realizes that her Marxism and her feminism are not antagonistic in any way to this journey. The two go together. If anything, she's looking for a vocabulary, a language, which is what I believe I'm looking for too, in my own way. A vocabulary that allows one to express all of this great mess of being alive, and the fact that one can never just be a denizen of the mind alone, or in fact the heart alone, or the body alone, or the outside world alone, that we are going to be citizens with multiple citizenship. And that's a great way to be. We don't have to masquerade as people of just spirit or flesh. We have the great possibility of being both.
Right, right. So, there are times when I'm very disturbed and I'm speaking to my guru and I say, Gurudev, I'm just so confused. The answer I get is, excellent. That's a wonderful place to be at, And I hope we have managed to confuse you all completely. Because I want to just, before we start, would you want to read, or could we just get some questions maybe? Yeah, there must be lots of questions because I think we've completely confused them, Arundhati. But please go ahead. And the last 5 minutes, I'm going to ask you to read. Okay? So we have 7 minutes for questions. That's the timer there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Vani. I'm 23 years old. And you talked about spirituality, and I believe I happened to dip my toe in my own spiritual journey via running, which is very unconventional. But when I feel like I'm running and I cross like probably 40 minutes, I feel like I'm running in a void. And I wonder, what is the shape of this spiritual journey? Is it a triangle like Maslow says, the triangle of self-actualization? Is it a void like Buddhist cultures preach about? What is the shape of your spiritual journey?
I think that many would agree with you about running, including Rahul Pandita right back there, for whom it is a spiritual experience. So thank you. I would say that certainly for me, dance was for many years. So movement, there's nothing like movement really to help unleash that. Poetry was for me too. What I don't think I had quite realized is that poetry is not just about words, but that poetry is also about great gaping holes on a page. All those blank spaces on a page of poetry mean. They may not mean something, but they mean. They matter. They're the source of those words in the first place. So I'd say to you The only thing that was clear to me after my experience of 97 was that I needed in some way to make my peace with that emptiness, with that silence, so that I could be less terrified when it came my way again, because it seemed inevitable that it would come my way again. It was the most alive experience I've known.
Thank you. Yeah, yes. Can you just pass the mics quickly?
Hi, so my name is Sagar and I'm from Bangalore. So we can see lot many youth sittings here, right? So these people are depressed somewhere out of the mind, right? So I think depression is a first step to discover the own spiritual world. Can we take it into positive way? Because depression is a very negative word. You know, we see lot many doctors sitting around just earning from the word of depression. But for me, I think this word will take you to your own spiritual world, into your own God, what you want to discover around. Is it true?
I think anything, Sagar?
Yes, yes, yes.
I think any experience, Sagar, that is personally catastrophic, as depression often is for the person undergoing it, anything like that can be a tremendous turning point if we allow it to be. So I think the possibility is tremendous in that. Certainly, it's not a dead end. Really, there is no dead end. And if I were to go back to the question that Lata Mani, who is one of the seekers, travelers in this book, what she reminds us of is precisely that. A cataclysmic brain injury, which should have ended life as she knew it. And it did. But that became the turning point, and something else opened up. So I think trapdoors beneath our feet are waiting to open up. We tumble into them, they're dark, they're terrifying, and then there is a kind of freedom as well. And that possibility exists for every human being. All it really takes is to be willing to be surprised and human. That's all.
Thank you so much.
It's a possibility, Sagar. Don't get depressed because you think you're beginning your spiritual journey.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because I have seen so many of my friends, they just talk silly saying I'm depressed because of certain thing. But I think you discover your own world in the depression. You think about yourself. Yesterday you was not. When you're depressed because of yourself and your inner world. And then you try to find out your external world where you find your own God. You may find your mother as a God in a depression because you go and cry with her. Right? So that's what I think of. And I think that's what, Koletkar sir write about, right? In Jejuri. So this is really a different word what we have discovered as depression. But I think this can lead us to something very positive in life.
I'd agree, and I'd say depression is often experienced as numbness, as the absence of aliveness, the absence of energy, frozenness. What begins to happen with any daily spiritual practice, I can only speak for myself. For me, a daily non-verbal spiritual practice was very important because I spent a lot of my life around words. A non-verbal practice was essential. What that begins to do is to open up pockets within the self that are sealed, locked up, closed away from the outside world and from yourself. So it's basically just reclaiming life, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there another question? Yeah.
Greetings to the esteemed. My name is
Just hold it close to you,
sorry.
please.
Greetings to the esteemed. My name is Chitra. So as you said that we meet travelers in our journey to the targeted destination. But in our generation, people come and people go. So there is need of affirmation and conformity from the society. So how to make your mind that if people come and go, we need to stick to the path and move, because people don't stay forever. That is what I wanted.
What is your name?
Chitra.
Chitra. Chitra, people have always come and gone. It's not just your generation.
Yeah.
They've always done that. Very annoying of them, but they do it.
But there is need for affirmation. People should accept me. Like my closer one, some people should stay.
Yes,
That is
I
what-
know.
Yeah.
I think we've all experienced that, and we all wish they stayed, and it would be wonderful if they loved us back and continued to love us back forever. But I think, Chitra, the essential journey for everyone, and this is how it has always been, though the challenges may seem different generation to generation, fundamentally, what we're looking for is just a journey of becoming more and more ourselves. So we are less dependent on the other for affirmation, and we enjoy the other much more when we are less dependent on them. And therefore, it becomes a happier, freer, more joyful way of being with the other. Is there a way to that? Yes, there is a way. And that way, for me, was about a daily practice. I don't know what it's going to be for you.
She's a dancer, yes. An NCC cadet, yeah, okay.
An NCC cadet. For me, marching and all that stuff awakens.
March on.
Thank you.
Lovely, okay. Could we, okay, that's one last question and then some readings, please.
You mentioned consecration in one. Also in your book, More Than a Life, there is this process that you describe. I've always, coming from a very scientific background, it always sounded like a very difficult for me to accept what is consecration. So if you want to shed some more light, how do you explain consecration of any temple or any object to somebody who's a little bit suspicious of this type of stuff?
What's your name?
Arjun.
Arjun. So Arjun, I don't know. I don't know how it works, okay? All I do know is that experientially, when I was willing to consider myself to be truly a seeker, which meant that I was willing to take crumbs of guidance from wherever it came from. It didn't matter where. As long as there was guidance, I was ready to take it. I began to realize that there were some people I just wanted to be around much more than others. There were some places I wanted to be around much more than others. And I couldn't quite explain why. Can I explain it today? No, I cannot, because I don't know how the process of consecration, I don't know the esoteric nuances of it. But I do know that there is a process by which, and that's why I mentioned a non-verbal spiritual practice. There is a process by which this has nothing to do with the mind. It has nothing to do with reading philosophy or being able to quote the scriptures. It has nothing to do with any of that. It is just to do with learning to inhabit yourself in a particular way that compels you to confront your own inner bottlenecks and go beyond them, not through therapy. There is a deeper, more direct route. For me, verbally, that happened through poetry. And now I began to discover the non-verbal route. That for me happened thanks to a guru who made consecration come alive for me experientially. I realized that there is a difference between merely performing a daily practice as a technique. This is not a technique. In poetry as well, and Shudip is here, we know what it's like to practice poetry as a technique. You can write a sonnet, you can write a ghazal. That's technique. But there is a moment when technique morphs into something else. On the spiritual journey, that happened for me through a consecrated practice. It doesn't require you to follow any belief system. It doesn't require you to follow a particular person. It doesn't require you to blindly surrender to anyone. It just requires you to allow that practice to ripen and deepen within you. Bhakti is a commitment to that inner journey. Bhakti is not about uncritical surrender to any one person. Certainly, that is the tragedy, I think, when we speak of bhakti in terms of allegiance to the far right, the way it's being used today. It's a travesty of the word, bhakti. Bhakti has nothing to do with that. Bhakti is not about a dictator. The deity was never a dictator. the deity was always this endearingly fallible, human, loving, divine.
Okay, Arundhati, we've got really running short of time. What can you read for us in the last 2 minutes?
I'll read you a one-line poem. It's a poem to the goddess, to Linga Bhairavi. It's in this book.
Okay.
And it's called Goddess. In her burning rainforest, silence is so alive. You can hear listening. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Arundhati. You know, I actually want to go back and just quote that one line you spoke about bhakti, not being about obedience, but about commitment, and a commitment to an unfolding inner journey, which means that there is no end. I mean, the horizon keeps moving, right? And as you go, I mean, it could be outward, but it's inward, and it's amazing the worlds within you and where they're going to take you to the different dimensions that you will discover as the journey goes on, right? Deepa, are we over? Run out of time? There's 1 minute left. I wanted to ask Arundhati one question. Arundhati. Okay. I just wanted to ask you about when we talk about the light, right? How would you define the light? Well, lots of people say in their meditation, they can't visualize anything. What are you talking about, right? For some of us, it's easy to move through energy spaces, see different energies. But when we talk about the light, it's equaling, you know, an equivalent to enlightenment. Is it? Do you need to see the light? And how do you define the light?
I'll only speak of my own journey, Puneeta. I'd say for me, it's not about seeing light as much as it has been about inhabiting dark places and being comfortable with inhabiting those dark places. So it's not, for me, whether it's the arts, coming back to poetry and culture, because that's also implicated in this, whether it's about my engagement as a poet, or whether it's about my engagement as a spiritual practitioner, I'd say somewhere between being unconscious and self-conscious. This is just about becoming more and more conscious. That's all it is, just more and more conscious. You don't want to become one of those terribly self-conscious artists whose work is mannered and precious, and that's crafty. That's good technique. You don't want to become that. Nor do you want to become unconscious, flabby, self-indulgent as a writer.
Right.
You want to become conscious. You want to use words consciously. You want to inhabit silences consciously. That for me is what the light is about. Consciousness.
Consciousness. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, Arundhathi Subramaniam, what a pleasure it's been talking to Arundhati. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Arundhati and Puneeta Roy. It was an insightful session where you need to be aware of yourself, love yourself, respect yourself. And we'd also like to thank BluOne Inc., Mind and Soul series, for supporting us here. Arundhati's books are available and she'll be signing them. Grab your copies from the bookstores. She'll be right here.
Thank you.